Welcome to the Reasons to Reason podcast. I'm your host and captain, Sal Galati. This is the show that's going to talk about all the things we're not supposed to: God, religion, and politics. So strap in, prepare to get offended, and maybe, just maybe, our nation can learn how to reason again. Thanks for tuning into the show. There's a little bit of disclaimer. I recorded this episode back in November, first one. Didn't have a good mic, didn't really know how to edit, just had a passion to do something and did it. That said, here we are. 6-7 months later, podcast is doing well. It's in the top 10% globally. But if you started here, I wanted you to know that the show did progress and audio got better, the editing got better. So I know a lot of people, when I introduce them to the show, they start with the first episode, and that's great. I love the content. But if you want to hear where the show's at now, listen to the more recent episodes. Thanks for joining, and you're going to hear the mic change now as you go back in time 6 months. Peace. The premise of the show is essentially talking about all the things that we're told not to talk about, and I think that's folly. That would be God, religion, and politics. I mean, what's more meaningful than that? What's more relevant than that? You could talk about the weather and the Chicago Bears for so long, but we're going to try to focus conversation back to where it should be. We've been led to think that all these discussions are not to be trifled with, but we got to start talking. I think the divisiveness in the nation is a direct result of people not understanding that disagreeing isn't hatred. We need to talk, work through some background, some worldviews, and I'm going to take topics and go from the superficial and try to get underneath what's really driving it. And if we understand that, I think we'll see a lot more commonality. At least we'll understand where each other's coming from and not villainize each other. So how we got to this, I guess most recently is, we've had this election. I was wearing my, Make America Great Again hat. I put it on after Trump, the first assassination attempt in Butler, just because I felt like people needed to be encouraged, especially where we live here. It seems to be that the majority have a view, and I'm well aware that that is not a majority as much as it's portrayed to be. So I just wanted to try to put a face to the villain that the media portrays a Trump supporter to be. A lot of people have known me not because of my view on politics, but just because I'm a neighbor or friend or whatever. Half the nation that supports this guy aren't completely brainwashed cultists like the media portray us to be. And what I've noticed when people would come up to talk, they thank me for wearing a hat. It was usually all positive, by the way. I've only gotten a couple sneery comments that people didn't like the hat, and I encouraged them to come up and ask me a question as to why I wear it. But I noticed a lot of people, around here, they like the hat, but I asked them if they vote, they say no. What's the point? And that's exactly the point. I think there's a lot more people. I mean, we saw it demonstrated in this last election. Trump got more votes than Pritzker, so what does that tell you? If people get engaged and get involved, which is our civic duty, we're going to talk about that later, you will have your voices heard, and it works. But you have to get engaged, you have to get involved, and part of this, what the goal is to kind of arm you with some information that you probably haven't heard anywhere else. Not Republican versus Democrat, that's nonsense. Just get to the meat and potatoes of why we believe what we believe, why are we here, what was this nation founded upon, and be able to have an intelligent conversation with someone we disagree with. Not on the items that the media would want you to argue about, underneath the surface. Let's be more thoughtful. So in doing that, I'm hoping we pursue truth and love, and those elements will spread. So some groundwork for me as far as how this conversation is going to go. Get past the superficial. Don't look at things just from one angle. For example, from an education standpoint, be more well-rounded. We have a ton of great specialists in this country. The country kind of promotes specialty. That's how things are set up. That's how doctors get paid the most. So our best and brightest tend to go in specific fields. And in those areas, if you got a very, very specific issue, dynamite. The system's very good. When it comes to the holistic doctor, to the primary care physician, they're not paid all that much. So a lot of people don't want to go into that area. But really having those folks being our best and brightest and compensating them for that could take someone who comes in with a knee problem from getting a knee surgery to, maybe some diet, exercise, change this up, you have some inflammation. And I'm not a doctor, I'm just making an example. We could eliminate a very drastic solution to an issue that a specialist might arrive to a more holistic approach that does less carnage. For example, let's put it to real life. We had the COVID response. If you're only listening to a doctor and the doctor's only goal is to minimize the amount of people that die of COVID, if that's the only goal, with no consideration of like what was their quality of life prior to the pandemic, what are the issues that could have affected them anyway, regardless of them getting the issue, you would do the example that they did, which was lock everything down, destroy a lot of people's lives unnecessarily. But what the executor of that in that role, they have to take information from all sides and kind of evaluate what's the best course for the most amount of people, right? We can't make the best decision for everyone all the time. We have to make the best decision for the whole. And if we would have kind of thought about it that way, I think we've gotten a lot better. But the media doesn't allow us to think. This is why, and I'm encouraged to see people are turning the TV off. They're cutting a cord. We need to just start thinking, look at stuff, talking to each other, and let's look at our predecessors. And we're going to bring the Bible into this too for an understanding. I'm a Bible believing person, but I think even if you don't believe in the Bible, it's necessary to understand kind of current events and where we are today. Certainly the founding documents. And if we're going to go through these things, understand that that was something that they had a grasp on, and it translated directly to the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and then subsequently we're going to talk about Washington's farewell address and get it kind of, that's going to be today's topic. Let's talk about an example on how we get to the underneath, the underpinnings of what's really going on. Abortion. Okay, everyone wants to yell about abortion. What it boils down to is, do you have a biblical worldview that God created all life and all things, or do you have an atheistic view that things just kind of sprung out without reason, without rhyme, and subsequently were nothing but an accident? Obviously, if we look at it that way, we could understand that this is why people might have a different view on things. If I didn't believe that we were created in the image of God, I have no basis to try to encourage someone not to destroy something that's in their womb. But if that is made in the image of God, now we have to have a conversation. So as someone who believes in the Bible, I don't believe in abortion. But that said, I'm a U.S. citizen, and I think there needs to be a conversation about at least we should put some limits on this. And I think this election kind of bore that out, where we don't want to necessarily impose our will on anyone, which is not biblical. I don't want to impose my will on anyone. But at least let's have a conversation about what are we doing here. I think 80% of the nation would agree that some common sense limitations around it. And all these examples about the 11-year-old with the incest, if these stories are true, they're tragic, but that's not the norm. And let's talk about what the norm is. Let's talk about what really the issues are. And another item that when I've talked to people about it, like, this procedure of a DNC, when you've had a failed pregnancy just by, course of God or nature, whatever you want to call it. And there's a procedure to kind of help the women out in that process to mitigate the risk of infection. That is not an abortion. No one is looking to take away the ability for a woman to get that care. And when I hear people talk about it as if that's what's going on, that's not doing anyone any favors. It's fear-mongering. And I'm telling you, this is why people need to talk to each other, because I've talked to so many women that are very passionate about the abortion issue, where they think that procedure is on the line if someone gets elected. And that's insanity. So, a couple quotes to set the tone that I've come up with over the years. If you deny yourself the possibility you are wrong, you forfeit your ability to reason. Hopefully that's self-explanatory. We have to come to the table with the understanding that we may be wrong, or else we're not going to be able to think about anything. Origin of life is a prime example. You have someone who believes in God's convinced God created all, looking at DNA sequences, and they go, wow, this is intelligible language. This is a code, information, and that only comes from a mind. There must be a creator of this. Then, if you take it from, I've decided that there is no God, I'm looking at the DNA and I go, wow, how much time do we need and how much chance do we need and what are the precursors to develop this just out of nothing? And spend your life trying to prove that that's what happened. Again, that's not an evidence for God or not God, but it is saying that there is a bias that when people come to the table, if they've already decided what the answer is and they're going to work the evidence towards their preconceived determination. Another analogy is religion is to God as politics is to governance. So religion is a man-made concoction, in my view. Many religions trying to accomplish essentially the same thing. Many religions have a God. Many religions have several gods. Some religions have no God. Marxism is a religion. And that might sound foreign, but it's a worldview. It's a process where instead of God, the creator, being in charge, you give all power to the state, and the state will usher in a utopia if allowed to get as much power as it needs. So you could see that is not something I'm interested in. But God is very interesting, and God is essential, and God is an underpinning of our society, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. I think a lot of our secular views, we adopt morals and ethics that come only if there is a God, and then try to throw God away. And that might not be terribly clear right now, but we'll do that as time goes on. That's kind of the conversations we're going to have. So religion is to God as politics is to governance. Politics kind of muddies up the water of what governance should do. Governance is good. We need governance to have a safe and prosperous society. But the politics makes it like the abortion issue. That's a political game. That's not about evidence and truth and what's really going on here and arriving at the conclusion that's best for all. That's about distortion, fear-mongering, pitting people against each other to essentially assume power and impose your will on the people. So I hope you see the distinction there. Let's go back to the abortion. There's an example I give people, cut to the meat of it. You know, if I'm talking to an atheist especially, if there's a triple crown winning horse or a child, and I'm going to be drastic to make the point, who's deaf, dumb, and is missing limbs, which entity has more value? And I really haven't anyone answer me. I mean, maybe they believe it's differently in their heart, but they're too embarrassed to answer. No one's answered the horse. And that tells me that we all know there's something special. There's some meaning for that child. And where does that meaning derive from? I think we know in our heart of hearts it's derived from God, and that we are made differently than the animals. We are created in the image of God. So when we go to this abortion issue, if we just want to eliminate that element and not think too critically about it, I think we'll arrive at different conclusions. And if we stop, pause, consider what we're exactly talking about, and not be so flippant about the life that we're demanding we have the right to destroy. So now I'm going to give an example of how we can use the Bible to kind of glean ideas, glean concepts, and maybe try to understand. The Bible was a big part of culture till just maybe 40, 50 years ago. I mean, it wasn't a book to be mocked. You know, I talk to people that even if you dismiss the Bible as accurate, know that it's been around for a long time. So there's a lot of works of literature that we don't believe are true, but we still study them and can glean from them. And I'm not saying that the Bible's not true. I'm just saying it's just a weird, I mean, to people that not understand the spiritual component of putting this book that's been so critical to the civilization, or a series of books, right? The Bible's not just one book, it's several books put together. But to just think that we don't have any use for that book anymore, I think it's spiritual. I think there's an element that is trying to deceive us and unmoor us from reality. So, for example, in Deuteronomy, the people of Israel just left Egypt. They've been liberated, and now they're being sent out to their land, and God's given them the law of how they're to live. He makes a promise with them. You keep this law, I'll bless you. You don't keep this law, I'll curse you. Whole series of things are happening. But the thing I've gleaned from it is, now they don't have a king at this point. God is to be their king. But prophetically, God's telling Moses to write down, when you do have a king, here's what the king is supposed to do before they even assume office. They're to write the law in their own handwriting. And I found that to be curious, but let's think about it. What does that accomplish? That would accomplish that the king that's at least read the law once. So how could we apply that to modern day? Is it shocking to suggest that perhaps many of our leaders in the executive branches, presidents, governors, are not familiar or have a grasp of the state constitution or the U.S. Constitution? I don't think anyone would be, that wouldn't be a grand statement to make. I think many of them haven't. I mean, I've heard some of our leaders try to quote parts of this document and stumble upon themselves. So what would be so bad if a new tradition in the commencement, an inauguration, is that the president recite at least parts of the Constitution to the people? Because I think two things would be accomplished. It would satisfy me that the president understands what the Constitution is, which is a contract between the government and the people might hear this Constitution for the first time and realize what rights they actually have. We hear everyone talking about rights and liberties and freedoms and protect democracy. I would imagine most of the media reciting this garbage are not familiar with the terms of this contract either. So what would be so wrong with that? So there's an example of how we could use the Bible to kind of maybe glean some new traditions and understand the methodology between why did they do it back then and why should we do it now. So let me read from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So right there, the whole contract hinges on this concept that our rights come from God. So if we want to just throw that away, which I think our secular society wants to do, and we're seeing the chaos that ensues. Look, if God is not real, I understand, fine. But you got to understand that this document hinges on that concept. This is a radical change from what used to be the case where the rights came from the king or whoever had the authority or whoever had the biggest gun. That's pretty much society until we got to this experiment. So if we want to just throw that away, you're welcome to. But understand what's the danger behind that and what's the sinister component. So again, it's not to prove God or not. It's to understand where we come from and how are we here. Another thing that you hear people talk about is that, separation of church and state. That's not quite what's in the Constitution. So we're going to read Amendment 1. Congress should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's very different. I don't want the state, the government, to impose their religion on me. I'm a fact-based, evidence-based person, and I don't need a worldly, man-made religion imposed on me. I'd argue what's going on in the schools today, and we'll talk a little bit about education and its role in our just as far as a society and how the U.S. needs a healthy citizenry that understands their rights and the Constitution and our history. But to impose certain things that are being imposed upon them, whether you believe in God or not, or I hate to break it to some of you, but Darwinian evolution has been mostly debunked. I mean, we have evolution, we understand evolution from the sense of, a dog changes shape and form over time, but it's always a dog, and a dog can only mate with a dog, and a cat can only mate with a cat. We don't have these interspecies mating. It's like, even if you have a liger, which is a tiger and a lion, they're still both felines. They're part of that same family. And we could go into the biblical narrative of what actually is going on when we read this account. But it's I'll just, for the sake of this episode, I'll just say it's very vastly different than what's portrayed on cartoons. But the evolution of kind shifting there's no evidence for it. And again, we'll have a whole episode on that. And the smart Darwinian evolutionary scientists, they're acknowledging this. I mean, sure, in the community colleges and some some of these bozo professors, which again, another topic, but the amount of excess professors we have that aren't really gifted in anything, they're just other than propaganda, they're still babbling about it. You go to the high school textbook, there's still stuff in there that's been debunked decades ago. But look, it's not a battle about, like, I'm upset that they're not teaching that, the biblical account is a viable answer to these questions. I'm more upset of what are the long-term ramifications of this. If you convince a society that they came from nothing, they have no meaning, they have no purpose, that it's only derived from their head, but they're just essentially a series of accidents, you're going to see some consequences that we're seeing today. So I hope you're seeing that it's kind of connected, these things. They're not, I know they seem abstract. He's talking about the Bible, he's talking about government, he's talking about abortion, he's talking about creation. And as episodes go on, I'm gonna dial in, but just understanding they are cohesive. We need to understand all of them to arrive at truth. So let's go to the name of the show. It's Reasons to Reason. So what is reason? Reason is using logic to arrive at truth rather than emotions or feelings. So logic, the word comes from the Greek logos, meaning. It's a word that has kind of many meanings. We can't quite grasp it in English, but the reason, the why, what for. So when we say like zoology, sociology, that suffix comes from the Greek word logos. It's to have an understanding of, to know why something is. And if we look again to the Bible, John makes an amazing claim. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The word there in English is the translation of logos. So what is John saying there? He's speaking to the culture of the time. The Greeks were obsessed with knowing the reason why, and John's saying, I found it. So we have, what's the meaning of life? Many, many books about this. I don't know what the answer is. Everyone's got a different answer. John's claim is God is the meaning, and his son are the meaning. And we found him. We understand him. I give you a little taste of that because it's understanding where that word comes from, logic. Okay? So truth. Now, I believe there's been an assault on truth. We've been demoralized as a society. We've been demoralized to the point to say that there is no such thing as truth. And that's garbage. There is truth. Now, our opinions on the truth can vary. But when we say that's my truth and that's your truth, Essentially, what we're saying is we're giving up on our ability to reason and arrive at truth. So we cannot give up on truth. We have to pursue it. I'll prove it to you logically. If someone says there is no truth, is that statement true? So even a person that wants to say there is no such thing as truth makes truth claims. This is an example of borrowing things that can only come from God to operate. If there is no God, there is no truth. This is where the idea of science comes from. The original scientists were God-fearing people. If this universe was created by God, it has order, and we could understand it. We could do experiments and repeat things. If it just came out of nothing, it would be chaotic. Every time you drop the pencil, something different would happen. There are laws governing what's going on, and laws point to a lawgiver. Okay? So, again, most of these arguments that take the negative view, they self-destruct. And we're going to do stuff like that and understand. Because it's important. If we can't even agree if there is truth, what's the point? Don't even start. And maybe that's why we're at where we're at. People don't want to talk about it. Because if you could rely on this premise, which is only recent phenomenon, a recent phenomenon of complete stupidity and ignorance, that there is no such thing as truth. There's no sense in debate, discussion, exploration, experimentation. Everything falls apart. So it's important. Now, emotions and feelings. This is what's been put on a pedestal in our culture to arrive at truth. So if someone feels something, it's wrong, it is. If they feel it's right, it's right. Now, obviously, we got a little biblical story here that sounds familiar. The knowledge of good and evil. So we're not going to go into detail of it, but this has been the beginning. This problem has been around man forever. So two ways to look at it. If God exists, he's determined what's right and wrong, and we're to appeal to his authority. If God doesn't exist, we all decide what's right and wrong for ourselves. And that's kind of where we're devolving to. Now, again, it's not a proof of God, but understand the ramifications of there really not being a God. You can't say anything's wrong or anything's right. And this is the reasonable conclusion atheistic thinkers have arrived at. The honest ones. The ones that want to be dishonest and borrow things that could come only from God to apply their worldview. If you're an honest atheist, there is no such thing as right and wrong. And maybe you can't understand it yet, but we'll get there in an episode. So, practical examples about this emotions and feelings determining, truth. If I feel like I'm a heart surgeon, does that give me any authority to perform a heart surgery? Of course not, right? This is evident. Now, we're going to get to George Washington here, which is kind of this is the meat and potatoes of this particular episode. I stumbled upon this piece of work, and I think it gives me a good opportunity to kind of go through topics the way I envision going through it on the show. Washington warns us of not using emotion to make decisions. So he quotes, this is from his farewell address. The government sometimes participates in national propensity and adopts through passion what reason would reject. This is the premise of what I'm trying to get to here. We can't use emotions to arrive at truth. We must use our reason. So he also suggests that the love of power and proneness to abuse it predominates the human heart. Now, the Bible talks about the human heart and how wicked and deceitful it is. The prophet Jeremiah proclaims this. And what Washington had an understanding of, and I think a God-fearing person has an understanding of, is the more you know God, the more you realize how bad you are. We're not inherently good. That's secular humanism, that we're inherently good. You want to see how inherently good we are? Look at what happened after the lockdowns and the pandemonium. There wasn't even a food scarcity, but look how people treated each other. That's what's in the heart. Now, we have the luxury in this country, if everyone has what they need, food, water, shelter, we don't see that nasty side. But that's what's driving us. Washington had a sense of that. And this is why the government was set up to really limit anyone's ability to have too much power. So now for Washington's farewell address. First off, take a read. I don't know how many of you have actually read it before, and I'm not judging. I had only read it maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and it struck me it was during the COVID lockdowns and the insanity going on with the school boards and just nothing making sense as far as, we're not pursuing truth and reason. We're not using damn sense here. How could these things be so divisive on party lines with no thought? And then I happen to stumble upon it. I don't know how, and I'm reading. I'm like, wow, he is speaking prophetically about some of the sinister elements he saw and how to make sure that we kept them in check. But I would just urge you, this is an example even people that want to scoff at the Bible. You want to scoff at George Washington? Read this document and tell me that we're smarter than these people were. We are not. Think of one politician that could articulate something so eloquently as this man did. He was a general, he was a businessman, he was successful in many endeavors. He was humble, as we saw at the end of his career. So please, let's humble ourselves and not think that we don't need to look at these documents anymore or understand these individuals and what they read. Now, these men consumed the Bible. That was a pillar of their knowledge and how they view things. And okay, you want to say they're not developed enough, they're not evolved, they're not progressive enough. I don't know what that means when you see where we're at here now and the kind of the decision making capability of some of our leaders. So enough about that. Let's set the stage. They wanted to make him a king. And here's another biblical story that I find interesting. So again, Israel came out, they never had a king. Time goes on, they're in the Holy Land, ups and downs, and then eventually the people yearn to have a human king, like their neighbors do. Now at this point, there's a prophet named Samuel, and a prophet is one who speaks on behalf of God. And Samuel is going, look, you don't want a God, you don't want a king. A king, all the king's going to do is take your daughters as wives, your sons as soldiers, and take a tenth of your crops for a tax. And look where we're at now. Isn't it funny? I mean, really, is that all the government does is take from us? We need a government. We talked about that earlier, but the point where it's at now, it's not really representing the will of the people. It's representing the will of the people with the power. So I just find that another element of understanding. That said, little thought exercise. If we could have one form of government, what would be the best form of government? People, we talk about it, and it's kind of needs some nuance, right? So democracy, constitutional republic, electing officials in a democratic method. People say what we have here is kind of the best. Separation of powers. No one could have too much authority. Checks and balances. And I agree with who we are, right? But let me throw at you a king being the best form of government, and people go, they'll kind of pause. It would be terribly efficient. It would immediately, to a problem, they could address it. Quick justice, not long drawn out processes. The problem is we need an individual that's capable of being this figure. And the truth of humanity is no one's capable. And now that points to kind of a biblical narrative of why our king must be God. He's the only one who's perfect, perfectly merciful, perfectly just, all-knowing. But again, we'll do that on a different topic. But it's just kind of an interesting way to look at things that may be different than some of you have before. So let's talk about key points of this document. He wants to encourage everyone to protect the Constitution, seek common interests of peace and prosperity as a nation. He warns that we will not value what we have until it's gone. That's not a revolutionary thought. We are Americans foremost, and common culture is essential. So he understood common culture. I think this is another thing that kind of, when we say multiculturalism, what do we really mean? I mean, our nation is a melting pot, right? People assimilate to our culture, at least historically they have. Our culture is the assimilation. Our culture is the Constitution, the founding documents, that our rights come from God. Liberty, freedom, pursuit of happiness, ability to open up a business, kind of jump economic levels, go from poverty to presidency and back down. We have that mobility. I was going through the feudal system with my kids in history and explaining to them, in certain societies, there is where you're born, that's where you stay, no matter your capacity or capability. But that's not the case in this country. Now, because of the ability to go up, we have the risk of going down. And sure, if you want to put guardrails on that, I understand. But just understand this is freedom. This is the ability for us to go up or down, and that is the culture. Now, immigration is critically important, because if you set it up right, you attract best and brightest of all societies to your land. Take, for example, we live in a very diverse area where we're at. People, a lot of first generation, a lot of immigrants. And one thing you always hear, like if it's an Italian, if it's Polish, if it's Russian, you think of them as hardworking people. My case that I make is that, yeah, those are the hardworking people that came from those countries because they wanted opportunity that they might not have had in their homeland. Whereas maybe the people that weren't so ambitious, so risk-taking, were kind of content with the way things were, they stayed. Now, what does that mean as far as a driver for your society? If you get the most ambitious, risk-taking people all over the world to come here, that sounds like a great deal for our country, for our citizenry. But it's essential that we have a common culture, that we understand our history and where we came from, or else we'll devolve. So that's the point that Washington makes. Communities. This is another word that I think that's been altered. Now communities based on race or sexual preference. gay community, trans community, black community, Latino community. This is not what community is as far as what it meant for representation in our government. Now, if we look at like a district map for Illinois, you'll see for some reason where like other more sanely run states have districts that are kind of boxes, and they grab a constituency that have common interest based on where they live. In Illinois, near Chicago, you got these slivers that grab a hunk of Chicago and drive all the way west for several miles. This sliver, involving many towns. This is not meant to represent a constituency with common interests. This is meant to garner power. Because if you get a certain amount of votes out of Chicago, you control the district regardless. And so this is a sense of like breaking up what a community is. A community is where you live, and this is the example I give all the time. You take a black man that lives in south side of Chicago, black man that lives in rural Oklahoma, black man that lives in Atlanta, Georgia. They have different interests, different views, different struggles. You can't monolithically block them into one voting constituency just because of their skin color. How degrading. And I think we've seen in this last election, those things starting to fall apart. That you can't just lazily take a group of people based on how they look and say, if I feed them a couple lines, I'm going to have their vote. No, that's not how it works. Don't degrade people like that. We're more than our skin color. We're more than our sexual orientation. And the liberation of that, I think, is going to be just very helpful for our nation in general. So one item that he discusses, that this was the item that got me when COVID was going on. He had overall, he didn't like the party system, the two-party system, and kind of conflicting over that. He put it as the fury of party spirit and the desire to tame it. So I'm going to read directly from Washington here. And warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. This spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in the strongest passion of the human mind. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which is in different ages and countries, has perpetuated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. So we don't want power consolidated into too few hands. So think Washington, D.C. here, or maybe a global governance order. We don't want that. So the issues need to be as local as possible, and it should be truth that kind of sets us free, not my party believes in this, so I'm going to argue this point. Here he goes on. It serves always to distract the public councils, enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one party against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. So think school board meetings, villainizing concerned parents that were right all along regarding COVID measures on their children. Think our president saying a pandemic of the unvaccinated to the nation and how that divided people. He goes on. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. So, we used to export freedom and democracy. That was our goal. Now we export inflation and war. Let's look at the last few years. The CCP in China, is that a robust democracy? So, after COVID, during COVID, are we more like China, or is China more like us? I think everyone would arrive clearly. Censorship's gone up here. Lack of freedom has come up here. Power is consolidated here. I think we're more like China. We're not exporting our system on them. They're imposing on us. And the door in which they got in was this party dissension. Hating each other, arguing with each other, not about what was right and what was wrong, but just because this is the flag I bear, this is my party, and I'm going to argue it regardless. So separation of powers and power remaining with elected official, not bureaucrats. Okay, here's Washington. It is important that the habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration, to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres, avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department to encroach upon another. The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments into one, and thus to create whatever the form of government, a real despotism. So Washington knew the inertia naturally of a government is to consolidate. That's what it wants to do. So let's look at like the CDC, for example, and how out of bounds they got. Whether they were right or wrong, I think a lot of the things they were saying is proven to be wrong, even though many people that were saying it was wrong were villainized. But they started getting into areas that they had no authority. No one in the CDC is elected. So the government is supposed to, talk about democracy. The power of the democracy and being governed and having a consent to be governed is that we can elect these people. And if we don't like what they're doing, we can get rid of them. But if somebody's positions are so untouchable that they could go on and go on, no accountability, certainly we can see the danger of that. So this is now starting to come to light, and there's been some court decisions that are going to help to kind of limit the power that these institutions have. And remember that the CDC is to serve us, to guide us, to make decisions, but ultimately we make the decisions in a free society. So let's see what Washington's view of God and religion was in our public discourse. Now, I will tell you, it's a far cry from separation of church and state. This is why, again, why we have to understand the interconnection between these documents and the views. So here's what Washington said. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. So this is like, think of this example. Someone swearing on the Bible to tell the whole truth, but they have no fear of God and they don't believe in God. You might as well swear on a McDonald's kiddie menu. It means nothing. And this is what Washington's saying. He's not saying this is a proof of God, but we have to appeal to a higher authority to maintain our freedom. Now, I believe he believed in God. And because of that belief and that worldview, you have what we have now. But now we're trying to take what only could come from that view and kind of use it without God. And we're going to see it falling apart, and it is falling apart. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. So here's a biblical example. Jesus was asked by someone, Rabbi, he was acknowledged to be a good rabbi at his time, a good teacher. They knew he had some kind of vast knowledge of the scriptures. And he said, what's the greatest commandment? And he answered, okay, this is a really interesting concept. He answered, to love God with all your heart and strength and might. This is from the Old Testament. It's one of the commandments. And the second one is like this, to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, we've heard the golden rule before. A concept of that has existed even before Jesus' time. It's in the Old Testament, to love your neighbor as yourself. The radical shift that Jesus makes and his claim is, the second one is like the first, to love God with all your strength. We love our neighbor because they're made in the image of God. It gives us a rational basis to care for our neighbor and love our neighbor. Now, people could say, oh, well, I could do that without believing in God, believing that they're made in the image of God. Well, look, Darwinian evolution, working it out, is survival of the fittest. There's no rational basis for not just taking from your neighbor if you can. I'm not saying anyone who doesn't believe in God would do that, but understand that's the natural inclination. And when we look at maybe like what a Hitler conceived, understand that Hitler's ideas came from out of Darwin's work. And if you look at the real title of Darwin, it's an extremely racist conclusion he arrived to. He essentially implies in his title of his book that no one really wants to remember is that there's favored races, that certain races have evolved more than others. And when you look at Hitler's work, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, he takes it right out of Darwin. And Darwin would appeal to the intellect of that day in the university sector, which is where these ideas come from always. You always see these radical ideas in the university, and then they trickle their way down. Hitler grabbed that if I war my people, I'll strengthen them, I'll kind of accelerate evolution, I'll come up with the Ubermensch, the Superman, and this is a good thing. He thought he was doing a good thing by destroying who he thought were the weaker races. So these ideas have consequences is the point. And what Jesus said in the New Testament puts meaning behind loving our neighbors ourselves. And this is what Washington's saying. You can only fake it for so long. We need to have this concept. We need to be held accountable by something other than ourselves, because this is the natural inclination of people to devolve. Here's something I want you to think about. This country allows you the freedom to not believe in God. But rest assured, when a country does not believe in God anymore, you will have to believe in what the state tells you to believe in. The next relevant topic Washington goes into is peace, not war, and the dangers of debt. So he very adamant about the dangers of debt, and then sometimes we might have to go into debt for a war cause, but be measured about it, and our nation hasn't. So like some things to think about. Savings bonds. You guys remember those things? I have some I got. I'm about 40 years old, so I think they were big in the 80s, and you would give them to kids as a gift, and then 20, 25, 30 years, depending on the term of the bond, you could go redeem it, and they'll give you the original plus the interest. Now, I had some, and I went, and I actually was talking to my kids about it. It's theft. They've inflated the dollar so much that what you pick up now 25, 30 years later is worth less than the original investment when you factor in inflation. So because of the inflation, they're really stealing from the debt holders. So that to say, it's by design, and it's an interesting thing to think about. Now, what he said was we need to tie kind of the spending to taxation and connect those two things, which is far from where we're at now. For example, you pass a bill. What should be done is what would be a healthy exercise, and be curious how public opinion would change. You want to pass a massive bill to send money over to Ukraine, for example. Send everyone an invoice to pay for it today. Don't borrow the money. You want to get behind this cause? It's going to cost every household $2,800, and you send them a bill. You think that would change public opinion? Now, people don't think they're paying for it, but they're paying for it. That's where inflation comes from. So they're not charging you directly. We'll keep taxes low, but if your money's worth less and less, that's how you're paying for it. But people don't see the connection. Now, maybe we do want to send money to Ukraine as a nation, and we think that's in our best interest. Part of that decision making is, what does it cost us? And if we never are going to actually pay for it, these bills will continue to be passed, the spending will continue to happen because it doesn't cost anyone. So he warned of something that he warned about having only temporary allegiances for extraordinary emergencies only. Now we're involved in long-term treaties with nations that we might not have a ton of common shared interest in, that may drag us into conflict when we have no strategic interest in that conflict. So from Washington's perspective, some of these intermingled treaties that we have is not a good idea. Now, is Washington right? Who knows? This is just Washington. Doesn't mean everything he said was scripture, but you could see the wisdom in what he was saying. So his whole view of how our relationship should be is that we shouldn't have any forever friends or forever enemies. Now, real life application. Look at Germany and Japan, for example. During World War II, no one could see that we would have the relationship that we have with them today. So this is why we don't want to get in long-term views of what our relations are like. Things ebb and flow. So now the next portion of it, the thing going on in the world is obviously the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And we're going to kind of dissect what Washington warned us and kind of how our country's operating. So I'm not taking a side on either, other than the fact that we need peace over there. So here's what Washington said. The government sometimes participates in the national propensity and adopts through passion what reason would reject. We read that earlier. So using reason over emotion. Now, if you look at how the media tries to sell the public, not a ton of reason going on there. It's all emotional based. It's all fear-mongering. The peace often, sometimes perhaps the liberty of nation has been the victim. Washington's pointing to the above logic. So in my estimation, this war has gone on too long, longer than it would have if we were not funding it. So the West, us, has prevented peace. And then we got to ask why. Washington goes on. Excessive partiality for one foreign nation, in this case Ukraine, and excessive dislike of another, in this case Russia, cause those whom they actuate to see danger only on one side and serve to veil and even second yards of influence on the other side, facilitating the illusion of an imaginary common interest in cases where no real common interest exists. Ukraine is long known to be corrupt. Are we to now assume all the money will only be used for productive ends to the goal? What exactly is our interest there? What is the goal? Shouldn't the goal be peace? Most recently now they're saying that the Biden administration is going to allow for U.S. weapons, long-range weapons, to be sent into the interior of Russia. How is that going to help slow this down and arrive at peace? When we have another administration coming in that has been looking to talk to both sides and strike a peace deal, now we're going to send missiles in. Look, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm a little too cynical, but I don't see that this being a positive move in order to arrive at peace, which should be the goal here. Washington goes on. It gives to ambitious, corrupted, or deluded citizens who devote themselves to the favored nation facility to portray or sacrifice the interests of their own country, to practice the arts of seduction, to mislead public opinion, to influence or awe the public councils. Can I say our defense industry? I mean, we have to acknowledge that people are doing very well as a result of the policy position we've taken. Real patriots who may resist the intrigues of the favorite, Ukraine, are liable to become suspected and odious. I had to look that one up. George Washington, repulsive. While its tools and dupes usurp the applause and confidence of the people, those for war, I put that in parentheses, to surrender their interest. So it's not in our interest over there, obviously. Nothing that's been communicated to me. Biden has not gotten up and told me why it's in our interest, national security interest, to get involved over there. Now, if it costs the taxpayer directly, this truth would be more evident, but it doesn't, because we just send money over there and our taxes don't go up. Our taxes should go up in line with the spending we're doing over there. But let's look at Washington now. Look how he's been demeaned and no one's perfect. Washington would not argue that he was perfect. But trying to take his name off of school buildings, trying to take statues down, and look at what he said and the wisdom that he had and what we could glean from it. Is it any wonder why people don't want us to remember him anymore? And is it any wonder why we're not reading his work? Instead, we're reading some actor's opinion on world policy, on foreign policy. How embarrassing. Why should we know De Niro's commentary on situations more than... And De Niro, great actor, love his stuff. But as far as, his intellect, I'm not terribly impressed by the guy. Why do I have to hear his views on things? He's entitled to spout him off. But why does he get a megaphone and we can't read what Washington had to say? So I want to provoke people to think, not see things in buckets of philosophy, religion, politics, separately. They're all connected. We have to look at things connected again. And in my opinion, they meet at God and an understanding of who God is. So we're going to keep going in different areas. I hope you enjoyed the inaugural episode. If it was a little choppy, I apologize. I don't have an editing crew or anything. I'm just kind of spitting it as we go. Thanks for joining us for another episode. I hope I got you thinking and out of your comfort zone. Believe me, the biggest fear your government has is a population that is thinking and talking to one another. So get out there, take a risk, start a conversation, make a friend, and reason with each other. Share the show with someone who you think needs to hear it. I wish you peace and love.